It begins with silence, not the kind of silence that soothes, but the kind that presses against your chest, as though the world itself is holding its breath. In a rotting cabin, deep in the Appalachian woods, a lantern sputters to life. Its glow reveals beams swollen with moisture, walls eaten by termites, and the heavy scent of mildew thick enough to sting your throat. And there, buried beneath a pile of rusted tools and rotted fabric, lies a small wooden box. Its lock has long since broken, its surface carved with initials no one remembers. Inside are relics that should never have survived. Yellowed photographs stare back at you, faces captured in stiff poses. But something about them unsettles. Eyes that seem too close together. Jawlines underdeveloped, smiles that don't quite reach the corners of their mouths. They look familiar and yet not right. Alongside the photographs rests a family Bible, its spine cracked, its pages swollen with damp. But the ink is clear, written in careful, deliberate script, names upon names, repeating in a pattern impossible to ignore. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles to nieces, brothers to sisters. Generation after generation, the bloodline folding back upon itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. The wind rattles the broken window, and for an instant it sounds like voices, low and mournful, as though the walls themselves remember. For decades, locals spoke of this valley only in whispers. They said the children were born different. They said the adults moved in shadows, their faces half hidden, their voices seldom heard beyond their own fences. They said graves had to be dug shallow because the ground could not keep them buried. But now, staring at the pages of this Bible, the whispers gain weight. They are no longer rumor, they are record, they are evidence. The silent valley had always seemed forgotten, tucked into the folds of mountains too steep to climb and ridges too narrow for roads. But its silence is not natural. It is constructed, maintained. A silence built not of peace, but of shame. And in this silence lies a question so chilling it refuses to be buried. What could drive a people to repeat the same marriages, the same unions for 7 generations? Was it survival, or was it something darker? The valley lies hidden where the Appalachian ridges curl against each other like the folds of an ancient hand. Roads do not reach it, maps rarely bother to mark it. To find it, you follow dirt paths that thin into little more than deer trails, winding deeper into a silence that grows heavier with every mile. The air thickens, carrying the scent of damp leaves and old soil. The trees tower above, their branches knitting together until the daylight feels dim, like dusk even at noon. The first time you see the valley, it looks ordinary enough. Meadows, tree lines, a few weathered cabins leaning against time, but the longer you look, the more unnatural the silence feels. No church bell, no children playing, no laughter carried on the wind. Even the birds seem absent here, as though the land itself had pressed its finger to its lips. Locals in neighboring towns speak of it only when pressed, and even then their voices drop low, their eyes fixed on the ground. Some mutter that nothing good grows in that valley. Others cut off the conversation altogether, warning you not to ask again. But every so often, when an old-timer has had too much to drink or grown too tired to keep his secrets, the truth slips out in fragments. They talk of families that never left, of names that never changed. They talk of children born wrong, their bodies twisted, their words thick and hard to understand. They talk of marriages no one dared attend, because everyone knew the bride and groom shared more than love. The cabins themselves seem to tell the story, their roofs patched with rusted tin, their porches sagging into the earth. Windows boarded not against intruders, but against the gaze of outsiders. Cows once grazed in these fields, but now the fences lie collapsed, the meadows left to weeds and silence. A few figures still linger, thin and stooped, slipping between doorways like shadows trying to hide from the light. If you pass too close, they vanish indoors, shutting doors quickly, as though the act itself were a ritual, a shield against questions. And still, in the cracks of the valley, Traces of truth remain. Photographs nailed to cabin walls, glass cracked but not broken, tombstones clustered on ridges, names repeating like echoes of themselves. Everything here points to one truth that outsiders always whispered, but no one ever proved. The Silent Valley does not merely keep to itself, it keeps itself within itself. In the taverns of nearby towns, the story of the valley begins the same way it always has, with whispers. Someone mentions its name, and suddenly the room changes. Voices drop, shoulders stiffen. The laughter that filled the air just moments before dies into uneasy silence. Then, always, someone leans closer, lowering their tone as though afraid the valley itself might be listening. They kept to themselves too much, they say. And then, after a pause that feels like confession, not just to themselves, to each other. For years these words existed only as rumor, ugly and shapeless. Yet the pattern was hard to ignore. Where other families scattered, married into new names, moved into new lands, those of the valley remained. The same surnames scrawled into courthouse ledgers, the same names etched on tombstones. A cycle repeating with the precision of ritual. Some believed it had begun as necessity. Isolated by mountains, cut off from the world, the first settlers had no choice but to take wives and husbands from within their own blood. A cousin married a cousin, a niece wed her uncle. Each generation narrowed the circle not by accident but by survival, but others insisted it was more than necessity, it was command. They whispered of a patriarch who once ruled the valley, a man who forbade outsiders from ever entering the family. His word carried like law, and the families obeyed, recording their obedience in the Bible itself, not as sin, but as legacy. The children bore the price. Babies born with twisted limbs that bent against themselves, infants whose mouths could not form words, whose eyes never aligned, whose bodies failed before the first winter's snow. Those who survived grew into adults marked by their bloodline, faces elongated, foreheads swollen, voices broken into slurred syllables. To outsiders, they became the living proof of the whispers no one dared to voice. Yet the silence in the valley never cracked. They buried their infants quietly, they locked their shame behind doors no outsider entered, and still the whispers spread, because the graves on the ridge told the story anyway. Names carved beside each other in patterns too close, too telling. A husband buried next to his niece, a mother whose headstone bore the same surname twice over. If these were only tales, why did the stone remember what the people would not speak? The truth of the valley does not rest only in whispers. It lives in objects, stubborn fragments of memory that refuse to decay. Step into one of the abandoned cabins if you dare, and you will find them waiting. Beneath a sagging bed lies a trunk, its wood warped, its lock broken. Inside, tied with ribbon brittle as straw, are letters. At first glance they seem harmless, clumsy words of affection written in shaky handwriting. But then the names appear, familiar surnames repeating like a chant. These were not exchanges between strangers, they were between cousins, uncles and nieces, bonds of blood cloaked as bonds of love. The words are tender, almost innocent, as if nothing about them was forbidden. On a cracked nightstand rests a photograph, its sepia tones faded but not gone. A family stands stiffly before a cabin. The father's arm wraps around his wife, his hand clutching her shoulder with unnatural force. Look closer, and the resemblance is undeniable. Her eyes mirror his. Her jaw is the same crooked line. They are not simply husband and wife, they are kin. The family Bibles tell the story most clearly. Within their swollen pages, family trees fold back onto themselves. A man is listed as both father and uncle. A woman appears as mother and cousin. The handwriting is elegant, precise, as though each entry were a prayer. But the words recorded there are no prayer at all. They are confession written without shame. Even the barns speak. In their beams, initials are carved over and over, repeating the same surnames, the same closed circle of kinship. Outside, crude gravestones lean in crooked rows, some bearing no more than a first name. Perhaps those belong to the children who never lived long enough to claim a future. After storms, bones sometimes surfaced from the shallow earth, pale and brittle, as if the land itself had grown tired of their concealment. Each artifact, each remnant, each faded word of ink tells the same story. Not one of rumor, not one of folklore, but one of choice, repeated and preserved through objects that refuse to be destroyed. If neighbors had only invented these tales, why would the evidence remain in the very walls, the very soil, the very script of their own hands? Generation after generation, the pattern deepened like rot spreading through timber. The first marriages may have been born from isolation, necessity forced upon settlers who had no roads, no bridges, no outsiders to mingle with. But by the second generation, the cost was already showing. Infants born with legs twisted against themselves, children whose eyes wandered in opposite directions, babies who could not swallow, who gasped through their first winters and never saw spring. By the third generation, silence had become tradition. Mothers did not speak of the children they lost. Fathers did not question the deformities in their sons. The family Bibles recorded marriages, births, and deaths in careful, reverent script. But never the details, never the truth of what those births looked like, or why so many graves bore dates too short, carved into crooked stones on the ridge. Still, the cycle continued. Cousins bound to cousins, uncles to nieces, brothers to sisters, over and over, as though some invisible hand wrote the law into their very veins. Each repetition bent the branches of their family tree back upon itself until the branches no longer spread. They coiled like a snake eating its own body, and with each coil, the deformities grew more visible. Foreheads bulged, jaws shrank, spines curved into unnatural shapes. Their voices thickened, words slurred and hard to understand. They carried their bloodline like a shackle. Neighbors outside the valley noticed. Some spoke of strange shapes moving through the woods at dusk, families drifting together in uneven steps, their heads lowered. Others told of young girls carrying children in their arms, though everyone knew the father was her own kin. And sometimes a child vanished from the valley altogether, sent to relatives in distant counties. No one said why. No one admitted where those children truly went. The VOD, Ellie's silence was not simply secrecy, it was ritual. Shame passed like inheritance, teaching each generation to hide what could not be undone. And still, the marriages continued, as though choice had been erased, leaving only compulsion. 7 generations, 7 cycles of repetition. Faces in photographs blur into one single expression, sorrow carved into bone. But curses do not end simply because time moves forward. They end when someone chooses to break them, and no one in Silent Valley ever did. The last time the valley's secret truly stirred was with the unearthing of forgotten objects, things left behind as if daring someone to look closer. In a county archive, a clerk stumbled upon a family Bible, its leather cracked, its pages swollen with damp. Inside, names appeared again and again, repeating across decades, fathers and sons sharing not only blood, but brides, births crammed together, lines crossing over each other, as if the pen itself grew weary of writing the same. The margins were stained, not with ink, but with what looked like fingerprints pressed there by hands long turned to dust. Near the valley itself, hunters spoke of stumbling upon barns left to collapse into the soil. Within one, under rusting tools and rotted boards, photographs had been scattered, faded, curling at the edges. They captured faces that did not quite meet the eye. Crossed gazes, slack jaws, a family staring toward the camera but never at it. Some of the photographs were scratched through with knife marks, as though someone had tried to erase the people from memory without tearing the paper itself. And then there were the graves. Uneven rows of stone, some marked only with initials, some without any inscription at all. Beneath one, locals claimed, a coffin was found far too small for the bones inside. The skeleton was twisted, bent backward upon itself, the ribs pressing inward as though crushed from birth. If true, then even the earth of Silent Valley became a vault for secrets no one could voice aloud. Artifacts, evidence, whispers, they pull together like fragments of a nightmare. And the question becomes, who left them? Who chose to preserve these scraps instead of burning them, burying them deeper, wiping them away forever? Was it guilt, a confession, a warning for those who might stumble too close? Because if the photographs were left deliberately, if the Bible was stored with care, if the graves were marked even in silence, then someone wanted the story remembered. Someone wanted us to see. But seeing is not the same as understanding. For how do you reconcile a valley that buried 7 generations of children with the reality that, to the families themselves, this was life, unchallenged, unbroken, unquestioned? The artifacts whisper one thing, the silence screams another. And so we return to the silence. It lingers heavier than any artifact, heavier than the graves themselves, because silence is not emptiness, it is protection. The people of Silent Valley understood that words could kill faster than famine. If neighbors spoke too loudly, if officials pried too deeply, if churches condemned too harshly, the valley would be destroyed, its families scattered, its shame laid bare. So they chose the old way. Secrets buried with the body. Whispers passed only behind doors that never opened to strangers. When children were born with twisted limbs or clouded eyes, they were not seen outside the cabin walls. Their cries never reached the chapel pews. Some lived in hidden rooms, raised in shadows until the day they too were lowered into shallow earth. Others simply vanished, names unrecorded, memory erased by silence. Generations carried this burden as though it were scripture. Speak nothing, show nothing, pretend all is well. But silence is not a shield forever. It rots, just like wood eaten through by termites. Outsiders began to notice. Teachers in county schools whispered about the strange children sent from the valley. Doctors reported unusual patterns of birth defects, cases that seemed to cluster only in one place, only among one set of names. The silence frayed, the walls cracked, and soon the story slipped into the wider world. Yet even then, the valley endured, refusing to speak its truth aloud. Old men on porches looked away when asked about their kin. Women stirred pots of beans without answering when strangers pried, and children grew into adults carrying the same pact: protect the family, no matter the cost, no matter the curse. That is the real horror of Silent Valley, not only the deformities, not only the graves, but the silence that bound them together, tighter than any bloodline, passed down like inheritance, a vow to never let outsiders know the full extent of what happened in those hills. And so we ask, was the silence their greatest crime, or their only means of survival? Was it cowardice, or was it the final act of love for a family too entangled in its own blood to ever be free?